Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Tomas Ocampo, Outreach Coordinator at Latin American Perspectives. Today, we will be discussing the main theme of the March LAP issue, Deconstructing the Post-Neoliberal State, Intimate Perspectives on Contemporary Brazil, with editors Wendy, Wolford, and John French. Wendy is a Robert A. and Ruth E. Polson Professor of Development Sociology at Cornell University. Her work focuses on the politics of social mobilization and the state in Brazil. John is a professor of history at Duke University. He has written and published widely on Latin American labor history, with a special focus on Luis Inácio Lula da Silva's presidency in Brazil. Good morning to you both. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you for having us.
So I guess we can begin with my first question. That is that in the issue, there's a lot of different themes that are kind of brought up. Can you summarize for our readers some of these themes in the issue and how they're covered?
Sure. I can take a first stab at that, and then John, please, of course, jump in. There's such a long history of writing on the state. One of the more important sort of categorical foci of analysis in academia and outside. And the research recently has really begun to focus on or to think about how the state can be taken apart, or how we can open up the black box of the state to better understand relations within the state and between the state and society. So this contribution on Brazil is to build on this new literature and to really deepen our understanding of what's happening in Brazil historically and today, with this focus on the internal sort of workings of the state, what one of our authors, Sergio Leite, refers to as the sausage making within the state. John, do you want to add anything?
I would put it into a broad context having to do with the struggle in the 1970s in the context of a military regime, a dictatorial political order. You had the emergence of sort of the notion of civil society and civil society versus the state, which also involved, a kind of dichotomizing society and the state as if they're two very distant and quite contradictory things. Of course, what's happened since redemocratization after a 21-year dictatorship is that precisely that with the progress of the forces that represent political forces, social movements, and so on, that come to represent one way or another the interests of the subaltern in a violently unequal society, in the context of their progress, first at local levels and then at state levels, and eventually 14 years ago in terms of the presidency and winning 4 presidential elections, clearly it's become obvious that you can't simply argue it's a capitalist state. You can't simply argue it's society against the state. You have to deal with the fact that the politics within the state and the politics of how state agencies, state actors, individuals within the state, how they interact with society is one of those areas that had not been studied sufficiently. And that's what this issue tries to speak to. It's not so much getting away from simply categorizing the state or talking in terms of, say, class factions, although we have an article in the issue that tries to make a case, an argument about the struggles between two different political lines, in a sense, aligned with different types of capitalist interests. But on the other hand, we're interested in the actual practicalities of how people, in the context of a politically somewhat better atmosphere in the last 14 years, how they've come to try to manipulate the state, how the state in turn, or state agents and and actors have in turn tried to advance their own interests. Because our point here is that the state is not a cohesive entity. It's a lot of different agencies. It's composed of quite divergent interests. And we have a nice piece about one of them dealing with the question of why are there 2 agrarian ministries, for example, each of which represent a different constituency. In a way, society colonizes the state, just like pieces of the state colonize society. And this is, the nubby of what we're trying to get at.
And I would just add that that's a really nice introduction or segue into the 4 themes that we've divided the special issue into. So, in terms of what John is referring to with the history of the transition from authoritarian government to democracy, we've called that in the issue a theme that runs through the papers on blurring the line between state and society. And to pull it even further back than the military government or its specificity within Brazil, the very terms state and society really come into being defined by their opposition to one another. They only make sense vis-a-vis the other. future. But clearly, as John says, over the past 30, 40 years in Brazil and elsewhere, particular activists who oppose the military government, or particular social movements or groups of people who had opposed the military, who had worked outside of the state and very much seen it as fortress, have increasingly been incorporated into government. And so you really see this flexibility or porosity between state and society, where there are people who were firmly within sort of civil society who now work for and with government, and vice versa. Politicians who are increasingly required to and really dedicated to working with factions or groups within civil society. So working with the participatory budget is probably the most famous example, but in the papers in the special issue, working with indigenous groups, working with movements protesting for land reform, etc. So that key theme of blurring the line between state and society is really one that we're emphasizing in the issue. We have three other themes that we outline in the introduction and that the papers really exemplify. The second one then is that we argue for the importance of locating or situating the state in time and place. And it might sound fairly obvious, perhaps, but we argue that the people tend to think of the state as floating above society or floating above particular places and working as a single entity, a unitary actor. But we're arguing, as John pointed out, that the state is a contested space, and there are multiple actors who are working within and against it, and who align with external actors in very different ways, and that we can only understand the state by examining the actual practices of particular state actors in particular times and places. So a number of the articles, particularly the article on indigenous politics by Cecilia McDowell Santos, which really takes us all the way back to the 1500s and trying to understand the relationship between state bureaucracies and indigenous peoples in Brazil today. A third theme that we outline is competition within the state. So thinking about the ways in which actors within different parties, different ministries, agencies, and in different regional areas, different administrative states, how these actors compete for resources that will help them to maintain their positions, to stay in power, but also how to do their work. I found this very much in my own work with bureaucrats and employees in the Federal Agency for Colonization and Agrarian Reform, which fights regularly to keep its budget, to not have the budget taken back by the national state, and also to keep its workers who are eyeing other agencies like IBAMA or the Ministerio Público in terms of thinking about different jobs or more prestigious positions outside the institute. The fourth and final theme that we identify in the introduction, we refer to as creating new political cultures and subjects. It would be very hard to believe that culture or subjectivities would stay the same over the kind of changes that we've seen in Brazil over the last, 30, 40 years, from dictatorship to democracy. But definitely the way in which people are engaging in politics and with politics is something that the articles all address in different ways and argue is very important, because those subjectivities then go on to shape the state and society. John, do you want to add?
I would add this originated in a conference that was held at Cornell University with quite generous support that brought together a lot of Brazilian scholars as well as Brazilianist scholars. And I think one of the points that was present, and we got into a lot of submissions when we published the CFP, and greatly appreciate the role of Latin American perspectives in keeping politically aware and politically conscious and contemporary engagements with the politics of Latin America, which is very, very important today. One of the things that I would add to the discussion here is that in many ways, the conference that we put together really reflects and this issue really reflects sort of the question about the engagements between mostly subaltern movements, interests, and so on with different parts of the state. On the other hand, the thing that we would have very much liked to have had would have been to have something dealing with the hard core of the state in terms of the finance ministries, the ones that are most directly related to the economy and to the largest capitalist interests, and how that figures out. But that's a subject where it has enormous impact on society. I think the piece that we have that talks about different class factions and things is trying to speak to that. But on the other hand, it's a subject that's a little bit away from a more of a sort of social movement, subaltern, insurgent, becoming part of the state set of interactions. And I think it would be very, very interesting if we in the future could think about a top-down within the state in terms of interests above state actors, as opposed to what we do here, which we call really very much an on-the-ground, almost bottom-up, outside-in, or inside-out approach to process and practices. So from that point of view, I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, because, of course, the hardcore of power within the ministries and the government as a whole don't tend to be the places where you're going to find the ex-movement people and so on and so forth. And yet, obviously, the success of the entire enterprise of a progressive center-left government trying to direct a capitalist economy in a way that is more beneficial to the majority of the population has to address those questions as well. So there's a lot of fraud issues. This is the beginning. This is a call to do more. It's not a claim to have answered all the questions.
That's a great point.
Yeah, definitely. And so far, your summarization was excellent. Something that might help situate the issue better is, can you both talk about how the timeliness and the relevances in the issue kind of help us see contemporary Brazil, and like what sort of things it brings out into the discussion that make it very timely?
I would make the following point in broadest terms, which is that, Brazilian society, if you look back over 2 centuries, and even beyond that, has not been a society, unlike many others in Latin America, where there have been major transformations. It is not a story of civil wars. It's not a story of dramatic conflicts. It doesn't have a Mexican Revolution. It doesn't have anything, it has a populist phenomena with Vargas, but nothing like the intensity of what happened with Perón and populism in Argentina. It's a society that's moved from, colony to independence, from monarchy to republic, from a more agrarian-oriented world to an industrial world with a minimum amount of change, and done so in the context of an extremely, one of the world's most inegalitarian distributions of wealth and power. And of course, what's been happening, if I think back to my first trip to Brazil in 1980, what's been happening in the last 50 years really is the process by which space has been made within the Brazilian political world and within the Brazilian state for actors that were formerly excluded, entirely excluded. Brazil is the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish its literacy requirement, which it only did in 1986 after the dictatorship ended. It only had its first mass participation in elections in 1945. It only had the free vote in 1932. In that context, what we're watching here, in a way, is precisely the process by which a state is undergoing a partial process or a partial process of democratization, or a partial process of becoming more responsive to a wider array of interests and more open to people rising from the subaltern classes moving into the world's power. But the core nodes of power in Brazil remain very, very exclusivist. I don't just mean finance ministries and banking and big business. I mean as well the court system, or as it's important to understand, the aristocracy of the toga, as it's called by some Brazilians, because the judicial system is another case, along with the foreign ministry, where the social composition is entirely white, entirely upper class, very, very aristocratic, and very, very conservative. And I think that, one of the things to be thought about in terms of the contemporary moment is precisely that the mild changes in 14 years in office, the relatively mild changes that have been made, enough to decrease extreme poverty as a result of economic growth plus programs to assist, like Bolsa Familia, that the opening up and the democratization of access and the sense of people no longer in their place and invading realms that are not their realms, that a lot of this has to do with the conservative backlash, which is what's pretty much going on now. It was one thing to pass it on from Fernando Henrique to Lula. Lula's reelection in 2006 was a shock, especially after a corruption scandal at the time. For him to make his successor, that's really concerning. But then for her, in an election last year in 2014, where they really expected to win, for a highly polarized electorate according to region, according to education, according to wealth, for them to lose again has really raised the stakes. And it's not that so much has been done that's so radical, but rather this is a profoundly conservative. They used to call themselves the conservative classes, which includes the middle classes, who are very much part of this, who are really dedicated to the maintenance of distinction in relationship to the majority, and for whom these are a bunch of interlopers. So much of what we're talking about is hopeful in the context of these movements and the ability to work with the state, to find ways into the state, to find ways to get state policies to at least partially address grievances and needs, full of contradictions and so on. But this sort of progress is precisely what helps to define the struggle today, which obviously is a very dramatic struggle, since there's an effort to oust a president against whom there's no charges of any form of constitutionally valid violations per oath of office. The attempt as well to bring down, to indict, which is the direction that they've been moving, the Luis Inácio da Silva, the single most popular president and the one who, without any question, is the most important political figure of the last 75 years, along with Getúlio Vargas. It's a very precarious situation right now politically. And it fits into the larger scenario in Latin America as a whole, where we're really seeing a turn to the right. And the circumstances vary, but the situations in terms of the elections in Venezuela, in terms of Argentina, and we're going to have to spend a lot more time thinking, we're used to, 15 or 18 years where the left has, through electoral means, has managed to become a major player in country across country. But on the other hand, we're really in a situation now where we're going to have to start grappling with understanding the nature of the new right that's emerging and the nature of the forces in contention. I don't believe they can roll back everything. I don't believe that's possible. History has changed. The Brazilian people have changed. The younger generation is in a very different place. But these are very, very long-term secular characteristics of Brazilian society, and we're open for a period of very intense struggle from here on out.
Wendy?
I really like what John just said, and I would just add that I think that the perspective emphasized by the special issue is one that I would hope would help to combat facile interpretations of what's happening in Brazil today, which I think you see as, particularly in the international media, as sort of hell in a handbasket. There goes Brazil again. It's clearly corrupt. The state is, formerly described as weak or feckless, and the sort of smelly underbelly of the Brazilian state. And I think that is much too easy a characterization to make, that really understanding relationships between people in the particular political parties, but also, as John was saying, the changing nature of the relations between those in power, or in power in particular, ministries or agencies of the state, and social groups, the way that those have changed, and the way that the conversations really pushed by Lula for participatory dialogue. One of his trademarks was really promoting dialogue between formerly divided groups. He would not necessarily please either group, or it wasn't him trying to say that everybody could have their cake and eat it too, but bringing groups together to discuss controversial issues like large landowners and the rural poor. And some people saw that as catering to both, but it was really a first ever attempt to try to have dialogue across what were fairly contentious spaces. So to look more closely at the particular people and the practices by which they've been governing today through the crisis, but also over the past, the two administrations of Lula and of Dilma, and then the preceding transition to democracy, I think is incredibly important to understand what's going on today.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for your contributions to the discussion. As we can see, the discussion on Brazil will continue to be very complex and a very important topic for many Latin American scholars, analysts, and writers. So once again, thank you very much, Wendy and John, for joining us and for giving us your take on the issue. And unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. So thank you to our audience for listening in. Please join us again in May for our next podcast. Until next time.